Well, I'm going to be talking about the blacks' contribution to winning the Civil War and some of the things that I never read in high school or any school as far as that's concerned. And there's some research I've done about that. We're going to be talking about those that fought in the war. We're going to be talking about black slaves that helped the Union win the war. And we're going to be talking about abolitionists. Thank you, Barbara. It's good to see everybody here, some of my neighbors, some of my good friends I work with, some people I don't know, but I'm just so happy to be here this evening. I got lots to talk about. It's going to be about 45 minutes, so bear with me, because this is a very serious subject I'm talking about tonight. As Barbara said, my name is Alfred Talley, better known around these parts as Barbara's husband. Tonight my topics will be black contributions to the Union winning the Civil War, the African American participations in the war, covering blacks that fought in the war, black spies who helped the Union win the war, black abolitionists during the war, and something about the Gettysburg battle because it was so significant in the Civil War. Now, the first thought that some come to mind is, why am I speaking about Civil War at this time and place? And why is the Civil War now so important? Are there old wounds about the war that still need healing? And that list goes on. But before addressing the topics tonight, I must speak briefly on some personal reflections of mine. My mother's name was Maggie Cheek Talley, and she was born in 1894. Her mother's name was Janie Sims Cheek, and she was born in 1863. Her mother's name, my great-grandmother, was Katie Sims, and she was born in 1850. Imagine a 13-year-old girl having a baby. And that's how old she was when my grandmother was born. Now, my grandmother used to talk to me a lot about Grandma Katie because I was 7 years old when she died. And she'd tell me about some of the slave things that happened. And these things were so profound that I never forgot about them. But amazing, at the same time that she was telling me about these things, when I went to school, guess what I was learning? I was learning about little black Sambo with big, thick, red lips, big whites of the eye, and singing the song by Stephen Foster, Old Black Joe. That's what I was learning when I went to school. And in a way, I'm certain that's one of the reasons why I'm here talking to you tonight. Now, I'm going to talk firstly about the Civil War. As we know, the Civil War began April 12, 1861, when Fort Sumner in South Carolina was attacked by Confederate troops. As you know, it was stationed by Union troops at that time. And this caused President Lincoln on April the 14th to declare a state of war. The American Civil War was the bloodiest war that America has ever been involved in. And it was, and still today, the most significant event in the dark history of the United States of America. Over 50,000 books have been written about the Civil War, and there are more to come. It claimed some 600,000 lives in total and lasted for 4 years. And since then, there have been several reasons that historians claim slavery was the cause of the war. And I'm going to talk a lot about slavery, by the way. But the major causes of the war considered by most historians was the black slavery in the South and its effect it had on Southern economy, and also the expansion of it into the states that were going into the Union at that time. It should be noted that slavery in the United States of America is considered by many the most horrific action against humanity in recorded history. Still today, the wounds of the Civil War yet exist in some minds over 150 years ago. Historian and author James McPherson writes, I quote, "The Civil War started because of uncompromising difference between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 as the first Republican president, that was part of the Republican platform. 7 states seceded from the Union when he was elected. In succession, they were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, and Louisiana, and Texas. And although Lincoln was against slavery, he did not go to war against the Confederacy because of it. No, he did not free the slaves. Lincoln's concern was the Union being restored. Now, why do I say that? Because that's what he said. He said this in his inaugural speech on March 8, 1861, I quote, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclinations to do so." And he further acknowledged that although slavery could exist in the states where they were under slavery, it would not be allowed in the new states that would soon join the Union, as I said earlier. And that was a very serious problem in that day for America, since many Southerners were moving into Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska to have larger and better fields to plant their cotton. Cotton was the king. Cotton was the king. If the cotton gin hadn't been invented, slavery might have ceased, because in around 1807, it was against the Constitution, the law rather, to import slaves. I'm not here tonight to harp on Abraham Lincoln. I'm just speaking the history. And those that want to know more about Abraham Lincoln, on another side, I suggest that you read Forced into Glory by Lerone Bennett, a one-time editor of Ebony magazine. And he truly had a different opinion of Mr. Lincoln than Carl Sandburg did. But overall, the rationale for slavery was that blacks were inferior to whites. Also, some slave owners thought that slavery was a blessing for them. And the idea which supported this concept on slavery was that slaves were not considered as real human beings, thus correctly designated to the level of racial inferiority. I quote the Vice President of Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, in his speech on March 21, 1861. I quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstones rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, natural and normal condition. This new government is the first in the history of the world, based upon its great physical, physiological, and moral truths." So in his mind, slavery was justified as a natural phenomenon. Now we'll talk about the African-American participation to the war. Frederick Douglass said, I quote, "The issue of raising African-American regiments in the Union war effort was at first met with trepidation by officials within the Union's command structure, President Lincoln included." So on July the 17th, 1862, Congress passed 2 acts allowing for the enlistment of colored troops. but officially enrollment did not occur until the final issue of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. The actual numbers of African American soldiers eventually comprised 10% of the entire Union Army, with almost 40,000 being killed in action. 40,000 African Americans were killed in action during the Civil War. I must say now I cannot agree at this point in time that African American was true to black people in America. How is that? Twofold. In the Dred Scott decision of 1857, Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the case Dred Scott versus Sanford, wrote in the majority opinion of 7-2, and I quote, "A Negro whose ancestors were imported into the U.S. and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen, and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court, and that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States." So until, ladies and gentlemen, July the 9th, 1868, Africans were not citizens of the United States. And that's what the Constitution said. Back to the war. How many in the audience recall the movie picture Glory starring Denzel Washington? It's everybody. That was the story of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Battle at Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And that regiment was authorized in March 1863 by Governor John Andrews of Massachusetts and commanded by Colonel Robert Shaw, a white officer. All the officers, by the way, were white and black units. And these men were the elite selection of people. They were mainly more educated and physically stronger than the average person. And other blacks tried to join that outfit, but they were turned aside because the outfit was full. The morale was very high, despite the fact that Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, proclaimed that both African American enlisted men and their white officers would be put to death if captured. That's what they did to the black soldiers. They put them to death when they captured them. And this order was enacted on December 24th, 1862, when the Confederacy issued the proclamation of the Confederate President, General Order Number 111, Number 4, stated that black soldiers and their white commanders, when captured, would be put to death. And that was in response to Lincoln's proclamation that was coming 8 days later, which Davis was aware of. The 54th Regiment's first battle was at James Island, South Carolina on July the 16th, and the 54th won that battle. However, they lost 42 men. And next they were on to Fort Wagner, which they are mostly noted for. This was the second attack, Fort Wagner. Going back. Yeah. This was the second attack on the fort, with the first assaulting failing. And this time the U.S. Navy was there to back up their support, raining shells on the rebel troops. But the shelling was not very effective because the Confederacy had bunkered down in Fort Wagner's bomb-proof shelters, although much damage to the fort was done itself. Later on that evening, Colonel Shaw ordered his troops to charge Fort Wagner with bayonets attached for the assault. And after several hours of Navy shelling, it stopped for some reason. And then the Confederacy went back to their battle station and began their own shelling on the 54th. Yet Shaw's troop continued on the charge, with Shaw yelling, "Charge, charge," and forward, and then falling dead from 3 fatal wounds very shortly after that. And of the 600 men who charged the fort, 272 were killed, wounded, or captured. The total regimental casualties of 272 in a single battle during the war would be 54's highest. In the end, the Confederacy finally controlled the fort. However, the 54th was acclaimed for its valor during the battle. And one soldier of the 54th, Sergeant William Harvey Carney, would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military award the nation presents. Confederate soldier later commented that he and his comrades were mad and infuriated at the South of Negro troops involved in that battle. How dare the blacks would take up arms against them? I should note now, however, that the blacks in the Union Army were not paid the same as the white soldiers. And this was a major grievance of the 54th, so much that eventually they refused to fight. The white soldiers made $12 a month, and the blacks made $10. So as a result, it was quite a grievance. Eventually, they were granted the same amount of money, but before that happened, one black soldier, Sergeant William Walker, was executed for mutiny in South Carolina in November 1863. How about that? Now Fort Pillow. The battle at Fort Pillow, 40 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, on April 12, 1864, resulted in a major onslaught. This fight is infamous for the subsequent massacre that occurred after the fighting ended. The Confederates had evacuated Fort Pillow on June 4th in order to avoid being cut off from the rest of the Confederate Army. So on June 6th, the Union occupied the fort and used it to protect the river approach to Memphis, and it had been used by both sides during the war. On March 25, 1864, Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, incidentally the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, attacked the fort and soon gained control of the fighting. The Union forces consisted of about 600 men, divided almost equally between blacks and whites. The black soldiers belonged to the 6th U.S. Regiment Colored Heavy Artillery. And it is reminded that most of the black troops were former slaves, now don't forget, who understood that the personal cost of defeat meant death. The fighting continued on into late afternoon. The Union forces lost several heavy losses when General Forces demanded that the North surrender. Forrest promised all combatants to be treated as prisoners of war. But Major Bradford, the Union leader, refused to surrender, and the battle continued on with more and much more killing. But then the North surrendered. And when they did, Forrest's men massacred them in cold blood. Survivors said most of the men threw down their arms only to be shot or bayoneted by the enemy, who repeated, "No quarter, no quarter." Historian Andrew Ward says that an autocracy occurred at Fort Pillow, including the murder of fleeing black civilians. Historian Richard Fuchs concludes that, quote, "The affair at Fort Pillow was simply an orgy of death, a mass lynching to satisfy the basis of conduct, intentional murder for the violence of reason, racism, and personal immunity." Confederate soldier in a letter written home said, quote, "The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but were ordered to their feet and then shot down." Later, the New York Times reported, quote, "The blacks and their officers were shot down, bayoneted, and put to the sword in cold blood. Out of 400 Negro soldiers, only about 20 survived. At least 300 of them were destroyed after they surrendered." Now, it should be pointed out, however, that the sources aligned with the South contradicted this story of the massacre, claiming it never happened. But most historians say it did. Another battle I want to make reference to is the Battle of Chaplain's Farms in Newmarket Heights. And that was in Richmond, Virginia, on September 28, 1864, resulting in 14 African-American soldiers receiving that Medal of Honor. Chaplain Farms, although eventually won by the Union troops, at one point the U.S. regiment was repelled and had to retreat. During the retreat, Company G's color bearer was killed, and the soldier that took over the colors was Powhatan Beatty, and he went back through 600 yards of enemy fire to retrieve the flag and return it to company lines. Of Company G's 8 officers and 83 enlisted men who entered the battle, only 16 enlisted men, including Beatty, survived the attack unwounded. With no officers remaining, Beatty took command of the company and led it through a second charge at the Confederate lines. By the end of the battle, over 50% of the Black division had been killed, captured, or wounded. And for his actions, Beatty was commended on the battlefield by General Benjamin Butler 7 months later, on April 6, 1865, awarded the Medal of Honor. Another Black soldier to win the Medal of Honor at Chaplin Farms was James Daniel Gardner, who won the medal for taking over the command and leading his unit after the white officers were killed. Quite an involvement. In Newmarket Heights, the Army of James, a force of 35,000 men, boasted the largest contingent of Black troops of any Union force, and Major General Benjamin Butler had made a concerted effort to recruit Blacks for his regiment to fight alongside the white troops. And the Black Brigade, led by Brigadier General Charles J. Payne, was to spearhead that attack on Newmarket Heights because General Butler wanted to convince himself that Negroes would fight. The attack was planned to be a surprise by the Confederates manning Newmarket, but Confederates found out about it and were waiting for them to charge. And prior to the initial attack, Butler rode through the ranks yelling to the troops, "Remember Fort Pillow, remember Fort Pillow." And that assault began with fewer troops than planned because of delay in assignments. However, the Black troops pressed ahead. When the Confederates saw the Black troops, they shouted who the Black troops were, and they had that name, by the way, and calling them vile and not worthy to be determined to fight white soldiers was really absurd in their opinions. The fighting was vicious and Blacks dropped like flies. And with most of the white officers dead, Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, the highest ranked Black soldier still alive, took up the command of the unit, and the battle continued until the retreat was the only recourse. Now, the next day, General Payne attacked again, however, and this time using a different tactic that proved successful. And the Confederates' fire seemed to slacken, and much fighting, and the Union continued to assault. And here also several Black soldiers who were involved in the fighting later earned the Medal of Honor. General Butler's report to the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, 4 days after the battle, in part said, quote, "My colored troops under General Payne carried entrenchments at the point of a bayonet. It was mostly gallantly done and with most severe losses. Their praises are in the mouth of every officer in the Army. Treated fairly and disciplined, they have fought most heroically." General Butler's question about Black soldiers' fighting abilities had been answered. Of the 25 Blacks who were awarded the Medal of Honor, yes, there were 25 during the Civil War. These are a few. Powhatan Beatty, Citation took command of his command, and all officers had been killed or wounded, and gallantly led it. Christian A. Fleetwood, his citation, seized the colors after 2 color bearers had been shot down and bore them nobly through the fight. And James Garner rushed in advance of his brigade, shot a rebel officer who was on the parapet, rallied his men, and then ran him through with a bayonet. And I have all of them that won the Congressional Medal of Honor here, in case you want to see them. That's James Powhatan Beatty. Look at that fine-looking gentleman. Look at him. And he was a slave. He was a slave. And how erect he was. And that's Christian A. Fleetwood. He was a slave. And James Garner, now he was not a slave, but he won the Medal of Honor also. Now we have a Civil War in 4 minutes by historian Harry Jones.
When the Civil War began in April of 1861, it was not legal for men of African descent to join the Federal Army. African Americans were serving in the Federal Navy. but they could not join the Federal Army. It was not until July 17, 1862, when Congress passed and President Lincoln signed into law the Militia Act, that African Americans were allowed to join the Federal Army. In 1862, regiments were organized in Kansas, South Carolina, and Louisiana. These regiments would be engaged in mostly small unit operations and engaged in combat in 1862. However, it was not until January 1, 1863, in the Emancipation Proclamation, that President Lincoln issued an order to his field commanders to receive men of African descent into all armed services of the United States. The Bureau of United States Colored Troops was established on May 22, 1863, with General Order 143. Active recruiting of African Americans began on a national scale in the South, in Union-occupied territories, and in the North. In the Western Theater, African Americans would fight in May of 1863 in the Battle of Port Hudson, the first major battle in which African American soldiers are engaged. In the Eastern Theater, African American soldiers would prove their mettle in the battle at Fort Wagner. The 54th Massachusetts would lead the assault, the failed Union assault on Fort Wagner. African American soldiers by the spring of 1864 would become a major part of those Union operations in Virginia. Under General Ulysses S. Grant, they would fight in the battles at Petersburg, and they would go on to earn distinction, with 15 Medals of Honor being earned in the Virginia theater. And at Newmarket Heights, in September of 1864, they would capture the closest point captured to Richmond to that date. And they would go on as members of the 25th Army Corps, the only Army Corps in American history to capture Richmond, Virginia. African American soldiers would serve throughout the rest of the war, earning the respect of their generals. An Inspector General report that inspected a regiment out of Mississippi, the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, reported that the superior status of that regiment was a reason why Negroes should serve in the active service. It was their service in the Civil War that leads to their enlistment in the regular army. In 1866, 6 regiments of African descent soldiers were established in the regular army, 4 infantry regiments and 2 cavalry regiments. When the army was downsized in 1869, 2 infantry regiments would remain and 2 cavalry regiments, and these soldiers would go on to earn fame as Buffalo Soldiers.
Thank you. I have one more soldier that I want to talk about briefly, and his name was Slave Gordon. That's him. Slave Gordon was known as Whip Peter, a symbol of the torturous life many slaves endured during the years when slavery was a way of life in the southern states of America. Little is known of his background prior to his servitude on a plantation in Louisiana. Now, he was severely whipped by an overseer hired by his master that later was to make him a famous figure in describing how dreadful and inhumane the life of a slave was during the time in U.S. history. Gordon escaped his captors in March 1863 by fleeing over 40 miles in 10 days before ending up in a Union Army post in New Orleans. And he told them that he had been bedridden for 2 months because of that horrendous beating. Later, however, he was recaptured by the Confederacy, beaten and left for dead, and even so he escaped again and returned to the Union lines. And he joined the Union Army and later became a sergeant in the Corps d'F, a Louisiana Civil War unit. And he was a leader in the siege of Port Hudson in May of 1863 that helped General Grant win the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, that gave the Union control of the Mississippi River. Isn't it ironic that Whip Peter, in his lifetime, was able to fight the enemies whom had sanctioned the horrific life that he and millions of others had endured for hundreds of years? Now I'm going to talk a little bit about black spies that helped the Union. Starting with Harriet Tubman, who everybody knows, and she's most famous of all. It is well documented what she did, and she engineered freeing over 300 slaves during 19 missions. But even before the war began, she had assisted John Brown in recruiting men for his raid on Harper's Ferry. And as a matter of fact, John Brown wanted her to go with him, but she was smart enough not to go. She was born a slave in 1822, and her birth name was Armita Ross, nicknamed Minty. And at an early age, she felt the pain of the whip and was struck by a heavy iron weight that maimed her for life, and she would have fainting spells and memory losses. And in 1849, she escaped to Philadelphia, and after doing so, helped others in her family escape. But she never left the slave states for good because she always went back and forth, finding other people. And when the war started in 1861, Tubman saw a Union victory as a key step toward the abolition of slavery and worked toward that goal under General Benjamin Butler. In that same year, Tubman became the first woman to lead an army assault during the Civil War. When General Montgomery and his troops conducted an assault on Combahee River, Tubman served as a key advisor and accompanied the raid, and more than 750 slaves were freed because of that combat. Although Harriet Tubman served in many capacities during the war, the federal government refused to grant her a pension when she retired. However, she eventually received one, but at a lesser rate, and that was as a widow of a Civil War veteran, and not for her own services. Harriet Tubman died March 10th, 1913. The video, What You Never Knew About Harriet Tubman.
Born into slavery on Maryland's eastern shore, Harriet Tubman escaped to freedom in 1849. It was just the first of her many dangerous forays, leading runaway slaves from safe house to safe house.
Harriet Tubman was a very spiritual, very religious person and carried this hymnal with her on her trips to bring people out of the Eastern Shore in Maryland. She would often sing with them and pray with them. And
is this her favorite song?
Many of the pages have little X's that designate those hymns as her favorites.
Oh, okay. Wow.
This shawl, evidently this was a very favorite piece of hers.
It was tiny.
Very tiny. But she was very strong, very determined, very directed, and had a kind of forcefulness and a kind of authority that people felt when they were with her. You know, they followed her orders and did what she said. And if they didn't, she very famously threatened to shoot them because she couldn't risk alerting the enemy to their presence.
Wow. Just took charge. Oh, what an amazing woman.
I think the common vision that people have of Harriet Tubman is this woman who would go south during the Underground Railroad and would bring people north. And that's all she was about, and that was her claim to fame.
By secret paths and waterways, Tubman did lead dozens of slaves to freedom. But her experience also made her a valuable military asset.
The skills she gained as a young woman in terms of the ability to, you know, go in the woods and travel in strange places translates into very useful skills for the Union Army.
In 1863, the Union command sent her deep behind enemy lines in South Carolina to lay the groundwork for a daring plantation raid.
She goes inland into South Carolina and establishes relationships with local people.
On the night of June 2nd, she planned a covert operation on the Combahee River. As dawn broke, they took 3 plantations by surprise. Tubman gave a signal, and the enslaved people rushed to freedom. They burned storehouses and destroyed crops, crippling supply lines. One Confederate captain fumed, their success was complete.
Thank you. Another black spy, Mary Elizabeth Browser, and she was born a slave in 1839 on the Richmond, Virginia plantation of John Van Lew. Mary's life was unusual for a slave because she was freed, but she stayed on and worked for the family under her mistress, Elizabeth Van Loo, a white woman known for being a major Union spy during the war. And Miss Van Loo took Mary Browser under her wing and taught her a lot about how to be an effective spy. And Mary Browser received a Quaker's education. And Miss Lou assisted her in spying for the Union. And one thing about her was very unique. She had a photographic memory, and that helped her to be a very, very good spy and caused her to have much success. And somehow or another, by the way, Miss Van Loo managed to get Mary Lou into the Jefferson Davis household as a servant. And pretending to be illiterate, she was able to have freedom of the whole household. And she would look at documents on Jefferson Davis's desk and record them in her head and take them out to people that were waiting to get this information from her. And she did that for quite a while. And Jefferson Davis couldn't figure out how people were learning about some of his secrets being so exposed to the Union. And this lady was the one doing it. Finally, Jefferson Davis finally got suspicious of her, and that caused her to flee for her life. But she was too intelligent to be a servant, and the thing about it, she was so smart to let them know that she was not intelligent. Finally, during the last days of the war, when she had to flee, she ran for her life because they had finally found out who she was. And there's no record of Browser's post-war life and no date of her death. But one thing about her that still lives is Mary Browser was inducted in 1995 into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Finally, John Scoble. John Scoble was born a slave in Mississippi and eventually became one of the most famous of all blacks that spied for the Union. And he was one of Allen Pinkerton's most trusted agents in 1861. And he had been educated by his owner, and was considered to be very, very bright. Allen Pinkerton, the head of the Union Intelligence Service, was also known as the most noted private investigator of his day, and he recruited Scoble because of his unique intellect. However, when Scoble worked as a butler, he played the ignorant role so well that it allowed him, too, to infiltrate into close contact with high Confederate military officials as they spoke of highly military secrets. And he would sing old Negro spiritual songs, and the enemy would look upon him as a buffoon and completely ignore him while he listened to their plans. He told them about truth movement and other tactics of battle, and later he would pass that information on to the white agents of Mr. Pinkerton. He played that role to the top. He sometimes acted as a servant to other Pinkerton agents, which allowed him more cover for his activities. And he was able to pass along many documents on Confederate orders of battle, supply movements, and as well as troop movements. Pinkerton said on several occasions that the role of Mr. Scoble undertook to spy for the North had saved many a Union soldier's life in that vital role that he did for his country. Now I'll speak briefly about abolitionists. Of course, Frederick Douglass was the most popular and famous of all, and the most influential African American in the 19th century. And he was born a slave in 1818 in Eaton, Maryland, and remained on the plantation until he escaped in 1838. Douglass was partially educated by the wife of his master and taught himself not only to read very well, but also to lecture. And his main objective in his writings and orations was the issue of slavery and its ending. Davis did not support Lincoln in 1860 because he felt Lincoln was not opposed to slavery as he had wished. And he continued the lecture for his human rights until his death in 1895. William Still, another abolitionist, was born October 7, 1821 in Eaton, New Jersey. And although he was born as a free slave, Still was considered to be a slave because his mother was a slave. And he was best known as the conductor of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, helping over 800 slaves to escape to freedom. Still was a writer, historian, and civil rights activist, and he kept records of the fugitive slaves to help them reunite after the war had ended. He disliked slavery so much from a personal reason because his brother was killed as a slave. He was whipped to death. In 1859, Still challenged segregation of the Philadelphia streetcar system and kept lobbying until the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law ending discrimination on its streetcars. William Still died on July the 14th, 1902. Finally, Lewis Hayden. Lewis Hayden was born on December 2, 1811 in Lexington, Kentucky. And in 1844, he escaped from slavery and moved to Boston, Massachusetts. At an early age, he taught himself to read and write, and later on in life, he became an abolitionist, lecturer, and politician. Lewis and his wife aided many slaves during their journey to Canada by keeping them hidden in their homes until it was safe to leave. Later, he became an agent and organizer for the American Anti-Society. Hayden also worked closely with William Lloyd Garrison, the famous white abolitionist, and Lewis Hayden died on April 7, 1889. Now, beside the many blacks that fought for the Union, and also those that spied, many others did just as important services. Historian Ira Berlin, in his book, Generations of Captivity, I quote, "By the summer of 1862, tens of thousands of black men and women, all mostly of former slaves, constructed fortifications, drove wagons, chopped wood, cooked food, prepared camps, and nursed the sick and wounded for the Federal Army and Navy." Close quote. Finally, before my epilogue, I'll speak briefly about the Battle of Gettysburg. It was fought July 1 through 3 in 1863, in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And that battle involved the largest number of casualties of the entire war and is often described as the war's turning point. Union Major George Meade's Army of the Potomac defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of the Northern Virginia, ending Lee's attempt to invade the North. And the total casualty count was 51,000, with over 15 killed the first day. Imagine 51,000 people killed in a 3-day period. The Vietnam War was about 7-8 years, and there was only 54,000. That's just unbelievable. And 15,000 the first day. The armies initially collided at Gettysburg, as I said, on July 1, and Lee urgently concentrated his forces there, and his objective being to engage the Union Army and to destroy it. That was the whole point. And the first day, they battled and lost all those people. And on the second day, most of the armies had assembled in the late afternoon, and Lee launched a heavy assault on the Union's left flank, and fierce fighting raged at Little Round Top, the wheat fields, Devil's Den, and the peach orchard. And on the third day of battle, fighting resumed on Culp's Hill, and cavalry battles raged to the east and the south. But the main event was a dramatic infantry assault by 12,500 Confederate fighters against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, known as Pickett's Charge. And that charge was repulsed by the Union rifle and artillery fire at a great loss to the Confederate Army and resulted in the Union's victory. And that led Lee back to a tortuous retreat to Virginia. And on November 19th, 4 months later, President Lincoln issued the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers and redefine the purpose of the war in his historic Gettysburg Address. I have an epilogue that I want to read in closing. I did not learn in the Detroit public schools most of the information that I have mentioned this evening. Their history books during my time as a student, and especially the years when I attended elementary and intermediate school, did not have any mention of blacks fighting in the Civil War, much less that of black spies who worked for the Union, and with the exception of Harriet Tubman, very little, if any, was there any mention of black abolitionists. The only abolitionist that I heard of was a famous white one, William Lloyd Garrison. The following questions beg for answers if American history is to be complete and accurate for those that come after us. 1. Why did we in the 2nd and 3rd grade read about Little Black Sambo? 2. Why did we have to sing Stephen Foster's song, Old Black Joe? 3. And in high school, why did we not learn that the American Constitution was not written to include black people, at least not until 1866 Civil Rights Law, and even more so by the 14th Amendment in 1868? And incidentally, white women were also omitted from being included until 1920, when they gained the right to vote by the 19th Amendment. 4. Why was slavery itself polished over to appear be less hideous as it actually was, as depicted in the textbook written by Gertrude and John Van Der Southworth in 1955 called The Story of America? And I'm going to read a few passages. On page 284, this was in 1955, by the way. Plantation life in the South was very pleasant. The master of the house spent his time in overseeing the labor of his slaves, in hunting and taking long rides through the country of his fine thoroughbred horses, or in entertaining at his home. Another passage. Negroes are by nature cheerful people, and the slaves did much to make their own lives enjoyable. The evening honors were often enlivened by dancing and by the singing of religious chants, the famous Negro spirituals which have become a well-loved part of American music. Of course, there were exceptions. There were some, though very few, harsh slave drivers and overseers who made the lives of the Negroes miserable. Those were cases with heartless masters, divided households by selling the husband, the wife, or the children to a slave owner who lived very far away. And this meant being separated from their loved ones forever. Such occurrences, however, were rare and cannot be regarded as typical of slavery in the South. Number 5, why was Lincoln pictured with several black little children at his feet thanking him for freeing the slaves, which in his own words contradicted that as not being true, or at least not for why the Civil War was fought? Number 6, another question. Why didn't we learn that 10 of our first 12 presidents owned slaves, John Adams and his son John Quincy being the exceptions? Moreover, 2 slave owners, Presidents Washington and Madison, signed the Constitution while being slave owners. Number 7, and finally, why didn't we learn in our American history classes the significant roles blacks played in helping the Union win the Civil War? Yes, our children and those that come behind us must be taught more about our accurate history and where black people have made their contributions to the growth and survival of this nation. Those that came before us deserve the adulations and recognition which they are due. And we, the present living, must make sure that their profound efforts are recorded in the final annals of America's history. Thank you.